acompañen esta tarde en esta sesión de cierre de las sesiones del año 2021 de nuestro Seminario de Memoria y Cultura. Vamos a cerrar con broche de oro este año con la presencia del doctor Andreas Huyssen, y sin mayores preámbulos ni presentaciones, pues le doy la palabra a Guillermo, que nos va a leer una breve reseña biográfica del doctor, que por supuesto prácticamente no necesita presentación.
Gracias, Hani. Voy a permitir leerla. Es muy breve. El profesor Andreas Huyssen es profesor de alemán y literatura comparada en la Universidad de Columbia, Estados Unidos, donde ha sido fundador y director del Center for Comparative Literature and Society y ha presidido el Departamento de Lenguas Germánicas. Es uno de los fundadores de la revista New German Critic y es miembro de los consejos editoriales de October, Constellations, Germanic Review, Transit, Keywords, Critical Space, Memory Studies, Lumina, Comunicación y Cultura. Su investigación se ha centrado en la literatura y cultura germánica de los siglos XVII al XX y el análisis crítico de la contemporaneidad, centrado en temas como posmodernidad y memoria cultural en los conflictos internacionales. En el campo de la memoria ha sido autor de referencia en los estudios de procesos de construcción de memoria colectiva. Algunas de sus obras más destacadas y representativas son Después de la Gran División, Modernismo, Cultura de Masas, Posmodernismo, editado en 2002 en español. En Busca del Futuro Perdido, Cultura y Memoria en Tiempos de Globalización, editado en México en 2002. Modernismo después de la posmodernidad, editado en español en 2011. Y Memorias Crepusculares, editado en 2014 en el español. Actualmente trabaja sobre arte de memoria en el hemisferio sur, tema del cual se desprende la presentación que el día de hoy nos compartirá en el seminario.
Pues buenos días. Yo soy Diego Zavala. My name is Diego Zavala. I'm going to be moderating the session, and I'll be speaking in English and Spanish as we need it. Cualquier cosa que requieran o si hay alguna confusión, por supuesto, siéntanse libres de hacer la pregunta o me pueden escribir en privado. You can write me through the chat if you have a question, if you don't want to interrupt, and then we will try to fluidly make the interaction with the questions and answers at the end of the presentation of Dr. Huyssen. So the floor is yours, and thank you so much for being here.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Guillermo, for the nice introduction, and thank the organizers for having invited me to this seminar and giving me the opportunity to present some work that comes out of a just finished manuscript, which is to appear as a book in about 7-8 months, entitled Memory Art in the Contemporary World, Confronting Violence in the Global South. So I will first give a general introduction of about 10 minutes and then move to images and discuss constellations of several works by the three artists I've mentioned in the title, Dora Salcedo, Vivan Sundaram, and William Kentridge. Memory art, as it first emerged in the final decades of the 20th century, is a vast field encompassing many different practices. In my recent work, I focus on a small group of compelling artists from India, South Africa, and Latin America, whose work I have followed since the mid-1990s. Guillermo Cuitca, Dora Salcedo from Latin America, Nalini Malani and Vivan Sundaram from India, and William Kentridge from South Africa. My argument proceeds by way of a series of constellations of their works, which illuminate each other across different political and historical contexts. The dialogue of memory works that emerges reveals aesthetic and political affinities as these artists negotiate their respective notions of traumatic experiences in relation to a transnational political and artistic context. Key aspects of memory art are distilled in the aesthetic forms and media these artists have chosen to inscribe their localized memory clusters into a global concern with human rights violations and political violence. The south-to-south axis of these juxtapositions in my book is crossed by a north-to-south axis, manifest in the ways these artists have drawn on the archive of northern modernisms and postmodernisms, appropriating and counter-appropriating aesthetic techniques and re-articulating them from the perspective of the post-colony. Such critical appropriation of northern artistic practices should thus not be seen as a break with modernism, but as its radical transformation in the context of contemporary memory and human rights politics. The possibility of a transnational dialogue on memory politics emerged after the end of the Cold War in 1989-90, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, obviously, and the subsequent collapse of the Soviet Union. When the utopian energies of the 20th century, communism, fascism, and modernization had dimmed and increasingly revealed their horrendous cost, the anticipation of brighter futures was replaced by an accounting for the past as warning to the future. The slogan "Never Again" emerged after the Holocaust, but it could mean different things in different parts of the world. In the global South, memory politics castigated not only state violence, but it also stood against the frequent Western support of autocratic regimes and against their embrace of neoliberal globalization. Memory's political context differed significantly. The end of military dictatorships in Latin America, the end of apartheid in South Africa, and the resurging ethnic and religious violence in India, a legacy of the partition of the late 1940s. Increasingly, palimpsestic memory clusters emerged as societies tried to cope with their violent pasts, learned from each other about truth commissions and trials, accountability and reconciliation. Thus, it is not surprising that artworks emerging from these different yet comparable conditions reveal astonishing affinities and cross-cuttings that become visible in comparative constellations, to which I'll turn in a little bit. Now, all the works I discuss in this lecture compel aesthetic experiences that transcend merely private consumption or immediate and transparent public address. Their politics are not those of an activist art that is geared toward direct and presentist intervention in the street, on the stage, or in the public sphere at large. These works have another temporality. They are activist, even avant-gardist, in a different sense as acts of memory, a term Doris Salcedo has used to describe her projects. Rather than locking us into a past, such acts of memory are of the present, with an eye to the future and the struggle for an alternative world. Now, the north to south axis is also and inevitably present in the conceptual frame of my argument, derived from Theodor Adorno's aesthetic theory. Just a few words about that. Adorno offered a pithy formulation for the dialectic of aesthetic form and historical political content, and I quote, "Art's double character, as both autonomous and fait social, is incessantly reproduced on the level of its autonomy," end quote. In other words, the form content takes in artworks becomes the content of form itself. To insist on this dialectic means rejecting the canonic binary of formalism versus what Bertolt Brecht once ironically called contentism in his attack on Georg Lukács's theory of realism. Now, elsewhere in Adorno's aesthetic theory, arguing in the context of the Holocaust, Adorno linked art to the, quote, memory of accumulated suffering, end quote. And he continued, quote, "All artworks bear witness that the world should be other than it is, end quote. Bearing witness to suffering, however, always includes an addressee. Rather than understanding the work of art as a closed monad to be contemplated from the outside only, as Adorno did, it is now to be understood as involving an open-ended process that operates between the work and its viewers. This process involves shock and seduction through stunning aesthetic forms, but it also demands heightened attentiveness and immersive contemplation. The work not only embodies memory in its media and materiality, but it produces memory in the social present. The notion of the artwork as fait social, as social fact, acknowledges not only the work's social genesis, but also the historical and institutional contexts of its reception. The idea of the work's autonomy is thus not abandoned, but recoded as a process triggered by the encounter of the work with its viewers. A more mediated notion of art's autonomy, key to an aesthetics of experience, is all the more indispensable since it alone can resist demands of artists to adhere to hegemonic national traditions, to a political ideology, or to the rules of facile consumption. Now, in recent memory art, it has been especially installation as form, linked to the notion of active and activating aesthetic experience that permits us to go beyond Adorno's still very objectivist notion of the work of art. Installation expands modernist work into the spatial environment, which includes the spectator, whose experience of the work becomes an element in its aesthetic effectiveness and interpretation. If art is to be effective as critique, it must develop dialectical strategies to draw spectators in through sensual aesthetic experience, which simultaneously demands reflection on how the construction of the work mediates knowledge about the world. Such socially mediated autonomy of the artwork, which I advocate here, is paradigmatically expressed in memory arts installations and in their intermedial spatial and temporal expansion of artistic practices. These installations are open to multiple genres like painting, sculpture, and drawing, as well as to technical support systems like film, video, slide projection, animation, and the assembly of objects. Installation art breaks not with autonomy per se, but only with traditional objectivist notions of the everlasting autonomous work of art and its individual genius creator. All installation art depends on multiple forms of collaboration, after all. Artist studios become workshops, and the artist operates, at least in part, like a theater director. As memory art installations are often on display for a limited time only before they vanish, they acknowledge the transitoriness of both art and memory. At the same time, there is the great paradox that their vanishing generates intense curatorial and museal activities of documenting and preserving the traces of their previous existence, memory projects in their own right. Now let me now turn to some of the constellations across a south to south axis that have captured my attention in recent years. They include, and here I'll draw on the broader manuscript before narrowing down on some examples, they include stop motion animation in the shadow plays of Nalini Malani and William Kentridge, with shadows themselves embodying the haunting dimensions of memory. The use of empty beds and abandoned domestic furniture, signifying disappearances in the painting of Guillermo Cuitca and the sculpture of Dora Salcedo. The very different deployment of Holocaust images and tropes in the sculpture and installations of Salcedo and Vivan Sundaram. the recoding through artworks of major art and history museums, including possibly the current recoding of public monuments, such as attempts to recode Christopher Columbus statues in Latin America and including here in New York. And finally, the architecture and design of new memory museums and public memorial spaces. But for the purposes of this lecture, let me focus on some works by Doris Salcedo, Vivan Sundaram, and William Kentridge. First, two installations in urban space, Salcedo's Noviembre 6 y 7 in Bogota, and Kentridge's Tiber Frieze in Rome, entitled Triumphs and Laments. And then secondly, two recodings of museums, Vivan Sundaram's History Project, which refunctioned the Victoria Memorial Museum in Calcutta, the other Salcedo's work on the Tate Modern in London. Now, commemoration of the past has, of course, always influenced public art. Celebratory statues and monuments dedicated to major events and public figures stand side by side with monuments and memorials to the fallen in war. Public art thus negotiates human history. It preserves memories, celebrates or criticizes power, and mourns the dead. But those older static forms of public art, the monument, the mural, fresco, the memorial, have been set in motion in contemporary installation practices. So here I would now like to go share my screen. Okay, can you all see? Is it all right? Okay, great.
Yes.
This is the first image, actually. Okay. Now, on November 6, 1985, at 11:35 a.m., a group of 47 M19 guerrillas burst into Bogota's Palace of Justice, seat of the Colombian Supreme Court, which on that very day was to decide on the extradition treaty with the United States regarding narco leaders. 53 hours later, after an all-out attack by the army on the palace, 11 magistrates and 101 others, guerrillas, soldiers, civilians, were dead, and the palace had gone up in flames, burning all the documents that might have been used in extradition cases. During the years that followed, this event, rather than being critically examined, was erased from public memory. Yet it came to be ground zero of Salcedo's later trajectory and the point de départ of her first major temporary installation in urban space, which you see in this image. It was only with Noviembre 6 y 7, the installation at Bogota's rebuilt Palace of Justice in 2002, that her work met the standard definition of installation art as the creation of a cohering, structured environment, i.e., installation as a single work. It was followed by other site-specific works, such as her 2003 Istanbul Biennale contribution of 1,500 chairs, or Shibboleth, her installation in the Turbine Hall of the Tate Modern, to which I'll turn a bit later. But it has been this massacre of 1985 that impelled Salcedo, who had just returned to Colombia after completing a course of study at NYU in New York, to focus her art on La Violencia, the decades-long festering civil war in Colombia. Her sculptures of violently disfigured domestic furniture testified to the traumatic after effects of political violence that itself is never shown. It took 17 years until she translated this by then successful approach to sculpture into a work in urban space in the center of Bogota, articulating a powerful memory that, absent any public investigations of the 1985 event, could only be marked by its date, November 6 and 7, a date that failed to mark the year, thus signifying traumatic repetition. Empty chairs lowered slowly from the roof of the rebuilt Palace of Justice for the duration of the performance are central to this work, reminding spectators of the powerful use of chairs and other domestic furniture in Salcedo's earlier sculptures, which you see here in an exhibition shot. The difference is that this work in and with urban space is not about uncanny familial spaces of unsettlement and mourning, but about the erasure of a salient moment in the history of the city and the nation. It speaks to the absence of a collectively articulated memory of a national traumatic event. The genealogy of this work needs to be explored in detail as it illuminates Salcedo's dogged work on documentation against all odds and thus speaks to the work as social fact. Since 1995, Salcedo had tried to get access to the Palace of Justice for her project. Her requests were ignored by the Ministry of Justice, but she persisted. With the help of an architect sympathetic to her endeavor, who gave her access to the palace on nights and on weekends, she and her team managed over several months to prepare the installation secretly on the roof of the building. And just when the whole project was threatened to fail for lack of permission, the Supreme Court came through in the afternoon of November 5th, 2002, and allowed her to go ahead. Couldn't have been more dramatic, right? Her extensive research and meticulous preparation had paid off. Long before the later trials and investigations of the event, and before President Santos's official apology on the 30th anniversary of the massacre, Salcedo also had gotten illegal access to much of the documentation, such as photos and autopsy reports of the killings and the mysterious disappearances of cafeteria workers and of the timeline of those fatal 53 hours of the massacre. This research then allowed her to structure the sequence of chairs lowered from the roof, which allegorically translated events that had transpired inside and inscribed them on the outside facade of the reconstructed building itself. Thus, she broke a 17-year-long public silence about that major trauma of the city of Bogota had suffered. Now, on November 6, 2002, 17 years after the event, her ephemeral installation began at 11:25 a.m., the exact time the M19 guerrillas had entered the building, killing a guard, and it ended, like the event itself, 53 hours later. The first empty chair was slowly lowered from the roof. As time went on into the afternoon and the evening, ever more chairs pointing to the victims of the siege came down the facade, sometimes singly, sometimes in clusters and at different speeds, all related to the reconstructed sequence of events inside the building. It was as if something formerly hidden from public view inside the building was slowly revealed to the public on the outside. Haunting as it was, this demonstration remained indirect, in line with Salcedo's sculptural practice. Hung from invisible wires, the chairs were moving sideways, upside down or backwards on the two facades of the building facing the Plaza de Bolivar, that very central public space where Salcedo in later years organized several other installations as acts of public memory, mourning victims of Colombia's civil war. As night fell on the white grayish walls of the building, giving the whole installation a ghostly presence, now preserved only in the stunning photographs and video. The inherent transitoriness of this installation, its documentation in photographs and video included, speaks to the fleetingness of memory itself and to its insufficient preservation in visual media. Now, Salcedo herself spoke of Noviembre 67 as an act of memory. An act is something that has to be performed by an actor or an agent. But the artist herself, contrary to much other performance art, but in line with her other work, remained absent in this performance. Transitory as other performance art pieces, this act of memory negotiated monumentality in counter-monumental form. It dissolved the static monument of the rebuilt Palace of Justice into a temporary sequence that gained its aesthetic power from its imaginatively abstract and minimalist reenactment of a horrific event. If the 1985 event had been traumatic, present only in traces in the public sphere, its sudden and unexpected reappearance in altered form as a public act of memory in 2002 had a powerful effect on passers-by who now witnessed it in a shock of recognition. Salcedo, present at the time of the event's duration, spoke to many people who witnessed the reenactment. And typical for re-witnessing a traumatic event at a distance of time, people told her time and again that they remembered exactly where they were and what they were doing at the time of the massacre. The project certainly succeeded in garnering public attention to what had transpired 17 years earlier. The media covered it only modestly at the time, as a memory event, not as a work of art. However, it may be no coincidence that the 1985 event later became the subject of legal prosecutions leading to indictments and to a public reckoning with events that had been previously erased from public memory. So it was, in some sense, also politically effective. Among all the art, let me turn now to Kentridge. Among all the artists from the Global South discussed in my book, forthcoming book, South African William Kentridge is perhaps the one most intimately and explicitly engaged with European traditions. Visual elements and strategies from early animation film in the tradition of Georges Méliès and expressionist drawing to Soviet avant-garde techniques are spread liberally throughout his work. And yet, his abiding appropriation and critical transformation of modernist European traditions from a South African vantage point is always embedded in his critique and self-critique of colonialism and of empire. There are major differences between Salcedo's and Kentridge's interventions in public art and their transformations of urban space. While both projects, Salcedo's and Kentridge's, were temporary installations and had broad public impact, Salcedo had chosen a prominent and representative urban space, Bogota's downtown Palace of Justice, while Kentridge worked a rather disreputable heterotopic space, the neglected limestone embankments of the Tiber River in Rome that had been a site for queer sexual activities and homeless encampments for a long time. Here, of course, you see a cleaned up version of the embankments. Salcedo's project focused on one major event in the history of Colombian violence. Kentridge created an epic work of memory in fragments on the embankments of the Tiber, spanning several millennia of Rome's history. For both artists, it was their primary studio practice of charcoal drawing in the case of Kentridge and sculpture in the case of Salcedo that served as ground for their projects in urban space. In both cases, the intimate scale of their studio work was massively, not to say monumentally, enlarged and transformed into an ultimately counter-monumental public performance. It is the proximity of their public interventions to their studio practice that enabled entirely new forms of public art in the mode of the temporary installation. Now, Kentridge's Triumphs and Laments, here you see a segment of the work on the embankments of the Tiber. Triumphs and Laments project for the city of Rome, as the subtitle tells us, strikes one as monumental indeed, at least at first sight. Creating over 50 images, 10 and more meters high, and covering a straight stretch 550 meters long of the steep embankments of the Tiber was certainly a monumental effort. The focus was not on empire, but on the eternal city itself, in the midst of which the project was located. It was the scale, not the content, that was monumental. The procession of images chosen to represent the history of Rome did not lend itself to a heroic narrative, and not just because of the inclusion of laments. After all, as we know, laments can themselves be monumental. This project was counter-monumental in another sense. Monuments are meant to last through the time. Triumphs and Laments, on the other hand, was constructed to fade from view and to vanish slowly over time. Now let me describe a bit how it worked. Each image of this 550-meter stretch of the embankment started as a charcoal drawing, Kentridge's primary medium. Here you see him in his study working on the charcoal drawings, the drafts for the later work. It was then, the charcoal drawing was then transferred to a somewhat larger size in ink, transferred to a computer and enlarged into a huge stencil to be hung from the embankments. The ink version was necessary because the production of stencils requires clear lines, not the blurred outlines in various shades of black and gray typical of the charcoal drawing. The stencil, in turn, then were just another part of the process toward the final image. And here you see how it is being worked on the shore of the river. The image emerged as the space around the stencils and blank spaces within were pressure hosed, thus exposing the bright limestone and leaving the image consisting now of the darkened soot, grime, and organic growth on the embankments once the stencils had been removed. It was creation through erasure, a technique central already to Kentridge's charcoal drawing for the stop-motion animated film of the 1990s, his famous 9 drawings for projection. But here, in Rome, the erasure resulted in a kind of drawing in reverse. The temporal complexity of this production process is matched by the simplicity of its effects. Clearly, like all memory, this installation would not be permanent. As pollution, lichen, and organic growth would increase again over time, the image would fade into its darkening background and become part again of the uniform dark organic matter on the embankments. Within 5 years, thus the estimate, the images would become invisible again. The play of visibility and invisibility in Kentridge's mnemonic device on the history of Rome points to the inevitable fact that memory itself always risks being short-lived and subject to oblivion. Of course, the 5 years are up by now. The project was opened in 2016. Now we're 5 years later, but unfortunately, I do not have an image of the current state of the work and whether it has really already become invisible. If not, it will certainly soon happen because pollution continues, right? The counter-heroic dimension of Kentridge's project reveals itself not just in the coupling of triumph and lament. As Kentridge once put it, and I quote, "Everyone's triumph is someone else's disaster," end quote. After extensive team research into the history of Rome, Kentridge's choices of images was often idiosyncratic. As he said at another occasion, and I quote, "Any clarity we bring to understanding history is always a construction out of chaos," end quote. Montage as the basis for such construction sheds new light on history itself by opening up the temporal dimensions of the historical imagination and the processes of memory. Thus, the friez's images refuse chronological ordering. They include silhouettes of emperors and popes, mythic figures like Romulus and Remus, the she-wolf who suckled Romulus and Remus according to myth, the goddess of victory, references to film and popular culture, a bust of Cicero, the rape of Lucretia, political figures like Mussolini and Aldo Moro, biblical icons like Jeremiah and St. Peter. The sequence of images does not just suggest anachronism. The organizing temporal principle is rather the simultaneity of the non-simultaneous, most visible in the superimposition and juxtaposition of images from different periods of Roman history. Thus, images of victims of earlier Tiber floods are juxtaposed with an image of African immigrants arriving in a small boat at Lampedusa today. At the other end of such a condensation of timelines, a knot of time in the memory image, as it were, is the image of a black square reminiscent of Malevich, which carries the inscription in parentheses, quote, "that which I do not remember," end quote. Significantly, this image is juxtaposed to an image of two deportees, hands raised in surrender, based on a 1944 image of SS victims in Italy. Now, if the simultaneity of the non-simultaneous is one underlying principle of this image sequence, repetition and reiteration in changed form is another. Thus, the Roman she-wolf appears both in healthy shape and as skeleton with hanging head, burdened by history. Popes mourned or deposed. Cicero's bust in whole and in fragmented form. Horses and riders in various positions of triumph or collapse. The goddess of victory. Here you have her on the left in her full stature, then in the middle as falling apart, and the third image as completely collapsed. So she's presented here recording a victorious campaign on a shield in the stripper form, upright, then falling, and ultimately as if beaten down. And finally, the triumph of death, a grim reaper skeleton on horseback, sword drawn, riding into battle. I don't have images, unfortunately, of all these different aspects, but if you go online to Kentridge Studios, you will find a a whole, panorama of the frieze, and you can move along it and look at each individual image. But ultimately, the question arises here whether some logic or some narrative thread holds this frieze together. Not surprisingly, there is no clear answer to this question. Kentridge is loath to give history lessons. He makes spectators think about potential links among the images. But it seems significant that in the very first image of the winged goddess of victory, and I've just shown this image, she is presented facing forward, as here, in the direction of the procession, toward the future, as it were. But when she appears again in these three progressively collapsing shapes later on, she is turned the other way, to the left, looking backwards toward the past, like Benjamin's angel of history. As our eyes follow the frieze, we see figures on horseback, a collapsing horse, a skeletal horse, all of them looking or moving backwards toward the past, which seems to indicate the very futility of progress. This is history in reverse, triumph denied. In the end, the lament clearly prevails, but it includes a stark reminder of the inevitable decline of empire. Now, empire is also the theme of the following juxtaposition of two projects that could not be more different. Both, however, recoded monumental institutions for a limited period of time. Doris Salcedo transformed the Tate Modern in London, a Western museum of international modern and contemporary art, subjecting it to a post-colonial perspective. Vivan Sundaram recoded the Victoria Memorial Museum in Kolkata, a colonial building dedicated to the memory of Queen Victoria, Queen of the UK and Empress of India. The Tate Modern, of course, is itself an already refunctioned industrial power station on the bank of the Thames, built in the immediate post-World War II era and decommissioned in 1981. The Victoria Memorial is a huge rectangular fortress-like complex with a giant cupola in the center and ornamental towers at the four corners, built in the style of colonial Indo-Gothic architecture, a kind of hybrid revivalist style British architects in India were fond of in the early 20th century. As a celebratory memorial to the British Crown and the colonial enterprise, it also stands today as an abandoned emblem of former British rule in India, just as the shell of the Bankside Power Station, which now houses the Tate Modern, stands as a remnant of the industrial age. Both buildings have themselves become sites of heritage culture. Both artists articulate an alternative memory from an elsewhere space in the global South, different from that of Western modernism or European colonialism. They do it in aesthetically very different ways, but it is the mode of modernist or postmodernist installation art that makes them comparable. So let me continue now to talk about them in more detail. Salcedo's Shibboleth was the 2007 showpiece of the Tate Modern's Unilever series, an actual commission that invites one artist per year to create a major work to be displayed in the museum's cavernous empty space, this empty space which you see here with visitors ambling about, with the entrance to the museum in the mid-level of the image. And it is this empty space that once housed the giant turbines of the Bankside Power Station. Site specificity was key to Salcedo's project. Overcoming persistent opposition by some museum officials, Salcedo's team removed a 167-meter-long corridor of 5 by 5 meter concrete slabs of the turbine hall's floor. Into this trench, she inserted the V-shaped structure of the meandering, at points widening, at others bifurcating or narrowing crevice, which had been constructed in its entirety in Salcedo's Bogota studio. The process involving molds and chain link fence imprints in the concrete walls of the V-shaped crevice was incredibly complex. Given its weight, the V-shape itself was secured at the bottom with 6-meter-long steel beams. Given the ragged edges of the crevice, hand-carved with dental drills, new concrete had to be cast to fill the gap between the crevice and the adjacent slab. Of course, the new concrete would look different from the old one, but Salcedo hand-painted it so that visually it all would merge seamlessly. It was a perfect simulation that confused viewers who tried to figure out how the hell this work had been constructed. But once installed, visitors entered the museum and facing the 200-meter-long empty space of the former turbine hall would have their gaze drawn down to the floor, if only not to step into the crevice, which extended in snaking or zigzagging lines all the way to the far end of the building. Now, if Gordon Matta Clark in the 1970s cut and split houses in what he called his architectural experiments, Salcedo split in two one of the major sites of contemporary art in Europe. Her work violated the very foundation of the building, though never threatening its stability. Rather than creating a sculptural installation rising on top of the floor, as all the other artists who had been part of the series had done in years prior to this event, her work went below the surface into the foundation. This gesture was more than merely an architectural challenge to a major European museum. It sculpted the underground, thus revealing what underlay the museum. The work's title, Shibboleth, which goes back to an essay by Derrida on Paul Celan being a famous German poet of the Holocaust. This work's title gives us a clue. Shibboleth is the biblical word from the book of Judges 12 that cannot be pronounced correctly by members of the tribe of Ephraim who, defeated by the tribe of Gilead, try to sneak back across the border river into their home territory, which had been conquered by the Gileads. When they failed the linguistic test of belonging, not being able to pronounce the word Shibboleth, they were executed upon arrival. With 42,000 dead, this is the largest massacre described in the Bible. Transcribed into the Tate Modern's floor, the idea of a shibboleth as a language test to prove belonging points, of course, to the exclusion of contemporary migrants who are deemed not to belong in European countries. The contemporary analogy is obvious, but it reaches way back in European history and its colonial legacies. The theme of immigration as exclusion and denial of rights, as a fundamental contradiction within Western universalism, emerges powerfully from the meandering crack that had visitors transfixed as they followed its path from the hairline crack near the entrance to expanding areas toward the other end of the crevice. Like a wound in the museum's ground, it made spectators reflect on racial hatred toward unwanted migrants, which has become ever more exacerbated in the age of Brexit and the rise of 21st century fascisms across the world. This work by an artist from the Global South did not simply illustrate the biblical story. Instead, it marked a gaping wound in the very constitution of European culture. And in some ways, it also combines simultaneity and non-simultaneity of the event of the Bible with the current situation in European migration. In an overdetermined metaphorical fashion, it referred to spectators to the borders of Europe itself and what lies beyond them. It was one of the first major artworks that coupled memory culture and its concern with past injustice, the reference to the Bible, with contemporary issue of unwanted migration. As always, Salcedo had done her research. She had not only looked into the history of Mr. Tate, who had made his fortune with slave labor on his Caribbean sugar plantations. She had also researched one of the flashpoints of the current African migration to Europe, the heavily fortified Spanish enclaves, Ceuta and Melilla in Morocco. But the constitutive racism of both colonial and contemporary is captured from a post-colonial perspective in this abstract yet deeply effective minimalist floor sculpture. Now, to many spectators, of course, the meaning of the title in relation to the crack in the foundation was not immediately evident. To become fully aware required active looking, thinking, and engagement on part of the public. Spectators had to engage the work from up close. Seen from a distance, there simply was a crack in the floor, requiring care walking, though not endangering visitors crossing it. It looked as if an earthquake had hit the Tate Modern, leaving its fracture in the ground. But as one followed the path of the crack, the meticulous sculpting of the crevices inside walls proved to be a lure that drew spectators in, had them kneel down and explore the work over sides of the crevice, touch them by hand, wonder about the detail and delicacy of the work. The work of the sculptor Salcedo became visible only in close-up view into the crevice. Inserted here into the concrete walls of the crevice, and only perceptible once you bend over the crack, was the wire mesh of today's border fortifications in Israel, Hungary, the Mexican-American border, or Ceuta and Melilla. The sculptural cavity became readable as a negative space of everything that has been excluded from Western culture, banned and hidden underground. Now, negative space it is indeed, but this negativity is, I would argue, overdetermined. The fissure in the ground reverberates not only socially in relation to migration from the global South. As marked in a museum of modern art, it also points to an analogous structure of exclusion in the canonization of modern art itself. Its minimalist shape conjures up the history of modernism, which until very recently has refused to acknowledge modernisms in Africa, Asia, Latin America. It is part of a larger struggle for recognition by artists from the global South, not to be dismissed as derivative, but acknowledged in their creative attempt at a reverse appropriation of Western modes of aesthetic expression. In 1989, Rashid Areen had first critically pointed to this bias in Western modernism with his London show at the Hayward Gallery called The Other Story, and with his art theoretical journal, Third Text, founded in 1987. Salcedo today is part of the telling of that other story in the medium of sculptural installation. Considering the complex history of that story emerging in the contemporary art world, I'm tempted to read Shibboleth as marking the general fault line between the Northern Hemisphere and the global South that still haunts our post-colonial, colonial present. It reflects in powerful visual and architectural language on the continuities between colonialism, racism, and immigration in politics and in aesthetics. What better place, one might ask, to do this than the major London Museum of Contemporary Art on the banks of the River Thames? Today, the crevices are no longer visible. They have been filled with cement, but the outline of the crack is still visible all along the turbine hall. It is like a scar of the wound Salcedo had inflicted on the Tate Modern, a wound, however, that for centuries has been a wound in the constitution of Europe itself. Now let me turn to my last example here, comparison with Salcedo, where Salcedo used the aesthetic power of minimalist sculpture to articulate a complex critique of a politics of exclusion governing Western culture. Vivan Sundaram, an artist who had paid significant tribute to minimalism in his own earlier work, particularly a sculptural installation called Memorial from 1992, Sundaram took the opposite track. He deployed a maximum of archival materials, texts, images, and personal memories to invert the meaning of a major memorial site, the Victoria Memorial Hall in Calcutta. Both artists operated from a post-colonial perspective, thus expanding and refocusing an earlier institutional critique of the museum, which had ignored issues of colonialism and in the constitution of the museum itself. I'm referring to the kind of museum critique that was discussed in sort of art historical journals, art critical journals in the 1980s. Now, both artists operated from a post-colonial perspective, thus expanding and refocusing that earlier institutional critique of the museum, which had ignored issues of colonialism in the constitution of the museum itself. If Salcedo's work destabilized the foundation of a major Western art museum, Sundaram's project problematized a museal site dedicated to the commemoration of the colonizer herself. In late 1989, Sundaram expanded the archival dimension of his work, which had been there from early on, to address that major site of British imperialism in India. His history project, this is the title, transformed a monument to colonial rule built from 1906 to 1921, and he transformed it into a site of alternative history seen through the lens of memory. Sundaram constructed a temporary installation in the museum's spacious Durbar Hall, and given that the installation was to mark the 50th anniversary of India's independence from British rule, it was bound to give us a counter lesson of colonial history. Indeed, Sundaram's thoughtfully selected material for the installation recoded the colonial building into a counter monument by inverting its inherent colonial meanings from his perspective of the post-independent secular Indian state and his own commitment to an enlightened urban modernity. Assembling a wealth of media and objects, he created an open-ended archive of Bengal history and its struggles for modernity. He focused on industrialization from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, on working class and peasant anti-colonial uprisings, as well as on classically modern Bengali culture. Here you see the installation, parts of the installation in that big entrance hall, the Durbar Hall of the Memorial Museum. As the spine of this installation, he inserted a railroad track traversing this main hall, suggesting 19th century modernization under British rule, with an ominous thick rope hanging from above. A railroad wagon, ironically equipped with rubber tires, rubber, of course, being a major product of India at that earlier time. A trolley loaded with a metal boat, piles of jute bags, each inscribed with dates from workers' and peasants' uprisings. Jute here was, of course, a vegetable fiber key to the Indian textile industry. A library of folders representing rebels against colonialism and the struggle for Bengal modernity up until the chaotic end of colonialism. Quotes by classical Bengali writers, such as Rabindranath Tagore, written into the cupola of the massive building. A 19th century printing press conjuring up the production of seditious anti-colonial newspapers and literature, plus cabinets and vitrines filled with photographs and audiovisual materials. And one could get lost here in endless description of these 25 tableaus which made up the installation as a whole. But one exhibit was especially telling. A large encased box contained a two-step pedestal covered in blue velvet with a red plastic garden chair placed on its top. Gazing into this glass box, toward the eye-catching red throne, one noticed a barely legible image of Queen Victoria imprinted on the glass. It was based on an enlarged photograph of the monumental statue erected outside on the lawns of the memorial. Glass box, faded, and ghostly photographic image, and the red anti-throne, the garden chair, were enough to carry the satirical take on British royalty and colonial rule, which still haunts India today. This effect was heightened by the fact that the four glass panes encasing the box were framed by four sturdy gilded picture frames whose solid look stood in sharp contrast to the shadowy image of imperial glory and the blood-red garden chair throne. Now, History Project, one might say, was about Bengal modernity and its fragments. Collaboratively constructed with a team of workers, intellectuals, curators, and historians over one whole year, It was a temporary installation like Salcedo's in the Tate Modern, or for that matter, like Kentridge's in Rome. Together with his team, Sundaram constructed his own open-ended museal counter-archive that spoke both to the fragility of memory and to the desire to construct an overarching historical narrative. Thus, it was not just about Bengal, but about the fractured construction of historical memory in a post-colonial situation. Let me now close the share and come to my conclusion. Of great interest in relation to my comparison with Salcedo's work at the Tate Modern is Sundaram's deliberate misuse of the minimalist aesthetic. Sundaram had come to appreciate minimalism's ability to drain objects of their authorial implications and to present objects in their sheer materiality. His earlier work on memorial would be a good example for that. It is in the nature of his selected objects that Sundaram differs from American minimalists like André or Serra. The objects displayed in his installation are historical and archival. With their patina of obsolescence, they risk recreating an auratic dimension for the viewer. Critics thus reproached him of nostalgia for Bengal modernity. But even if the objects, qua object, say the printing press, the quotes from major writers, the folders about rebels, even if the objects qua object may suggest an aura in the Benjaminian sense, History Project as a whole undermines any nostalgia for Bengal modernity. The paradox consists in the fact that the authorial gesture avoided in the archival objet trouvé returns powerfully in the overall narrative, which offers a palimpsest of memories and deliberately avoids coalescing into some coherent whole for the spectator, certainly not into a nationalist kind of narrative. The purpose of this refunctioning of the Victoria Memorial is clear. Anti-colonial history is powerfully inscribed into this counter-memory project. Struggles of peasants and the subaltern are recognized together with the march of industrial progress. At the same time, the very site of the installation points to a fascinating political equivocation between an approving recognition of Bengal modernity and a critique of this modernity's inevitable continuities with colonialism. Of course, by addressing complex historical issues such as these, Sundaram very consciously opened himself up to critical questions. His own struggle with this issue becomes evident if one considers the original title of the work, which was Journey Toward Freedom, Modern Bengal, which seemed to propose some journey towards an enlightened modernity not contaminated by colonialism. History Project, by contrast, I would argue, refuses such confidence. It does not give answers, but raises questions in its spatialization of memory, leaving space for the spectators to interpret the ambiguities of Indian modernity then and now. So despite their different handling of time and space, both Salcedo and Sundaram produce acts of memory, enabling affect and demanding cognitive and aesthetic participation of their visitors. Shibboleth and History Project were quite successful on that score with audiences. Such art installations, whether in museums or in urban space, may or may not change politics in a narrower sense, but they certainly create a significant public space for what one might call an affective politics emerging from a highly political aesthetic practice grounded in local and transnational legacies. Thank you. I will conclude here.
Thank you so much. I don't know if somebody has a question, if we would start with a first round of possible questions for Dr. Huyssen. Remember, I will be doing the translation. Recuerden que estaré haciendo la traducción. Si la quieren poner en castellano en el chat o decirle en castellano, yo haré la traducción. So here in the chat, it's one. It says, in present, past, urban palimpsests and the politics of memory, you make a criticism on the way that the metaphor of the Holocaust encounters the center of the reflection around trauma and history. But also this metaphor allows to articulate something like the international struggle against the violations to human rights. With the apparition of alternative ways of facing or posing trauma through art, as the ones you are presenting with the Contra Memorial that Salcedo does, how can different struggles can be articulated through memory without the danger of fragmentation or relativity in the politics of respect for human rights?
Okay, well, I think this is a very good question. Let me start by answering it perhaps with a reference to my own trajectory. Of course, I'm German. So from the 60s and 70s on, I've been concerned with the legacies of the Third Reich and the Holocaust in Germany. And then in the 90s, I began to observe how Holocaust images and tropes began to circulate around the world and began to kind of reinforce sort of local struggles for an acknowledgement of Latin American dictatorships, acknowledgement of the overcome apartheid regime in South Africa, acknowledge even the history of partition in India. And that seemed to me important, not in creating a kind of relativity of cases, but connectivity of national cases which emerged out of local conditions, local historical conditions, whether in Latin America, South Africa, or India, but nevertheless had a kind of, and now I'm using a problematic term, which seemed to have a connective tissue that in the past might have been called universalism. And I know about the problems. I don't want to use the term universalism here. So I'm using connective tissues that allow for a more global kind of understanding of these violations of rights, of genocide, of ethnic cleansing, and so forth and so on. So, and I think that precisely avoids the danger of relativity. Now, one more comment on that. Recently, in Germany, the situation poses itself quite differently. I don't want to talk too long about this, but there is a very acrimonious debate. Oh, wait, Diego, I'm talking too much now. I should have made breaks for you to translate. Do you need to translate or?
No, they will get the answer directly.
Okay, wonderful. Better than I am with my limited Spanish. Anyway, so there's been, the debate has been around the uniqueness of the Holocaust. And people in Germany, understandably, want to insist on some, perhaps not uniqueness, but the singularity of the Holocaust in relationship to other genocides, okay? And they want to insist on this singularity, not abandon that, precisely because they're afraid of relativization, when the Holocaust is just seen as another form of colonization. In other words, the idea would be that Hitler practiced colonization on the wrong object, namely on Europe, rather than on Africa or on Asia. I mean, I'm not sure, I hope that answers some of the question.
I'm not sure we can undergo or deepen on some things, but I think it mainly gets to the point that Adrian was trying to ask about the fragmentation and relativity. Okay, Susie has a question. I don't know if you want to, Susie, no sé si la quieres hacer en español o en inglés.
I want to make it in English, but I don't know if it's going to be understandable.
I hear you.
Try to be clear, but I hope, yeah. The sense of the exposition, the presentation you gave us, make me think about the materiality in art, in the scenic, the performing art in public spaces. And I was thinking that colonialism has this type of not saying about what meant to the countries that were providing prime material, like this kind of material that were brought to Europe for making industrial objects. And I think when artists make these expositions, these performances with this kind of materiality sense, interior, I don't know how you say it, thinking on the sense of the material thing, exposed to an idea of decolonialism or other kind of history. I don't know if people in Europe, in these places in London, where you show us these performances, what do they think about it? How do they receive it? That's my question.
Can I ask you, what kind of materials are you thinking of?
I'm
thinking of materials that have been mined in Africa, or?
Yes, maybe like mines in America, maybe like banana also, all kinds of things. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think this is interesting. I can't think of an instance where the artists that I'm most familiar with and that I've been dealing with are actually reflecting on the provenance of the materials they're using in their art. I think that I'm just trying to run through it in my mind. I mean, the objects that Sundaram shows in History Project are obviously all, objects, I mean, I've known the printing press that he presented, for instance, would have been an object that was most probably not produced in India, but would have been produced in, in England. I can think of these artists reflecting on the materiality of their work and where it comes from, but it's a good kind of thing to remind us, a good comment to remind us that the global interconnectivities of the world, or globality itself, is not something that was invented in the 1990s, right? But that it goes way back. And that in some sense, historians, I think, have shown that the late 19th century was already much more global than the period between World War I and 1989, which has to do, of course, with the whole, the whole period of the Cold War, where the world was sort of basically divided between two big blocks, and which prevented the kind of global connectivities which we see now, and which, as you point out, may also be presented in these materials. I was thinking, when you were talking, I was thinking also of the question of appropriation, which is very controversial these days, right? I mean, I have to probably deal with the question that I, as a white European male, am writing about women artists, colored artists from the global South. Is that allowed? And some people we know will say no, but I think they're fundamentally wrong. I mean, this is a practice of a kind of identity politics that limits any kind of expression. And that's why I'm emphasizing a positive notion of appropriation in my work, of saying that these artists from the global South are counter-appropriating. It's appropriation in reverse. The modernists like Picasso and others took the objects of Africa and Oceania, masks and objects of cult, etc., and used them for their representations. That was clearly a kind of appropriation within a colonial context. But now appropriation works in the reverse, and it has to be certainly allowed. You can't say that artists from the global south are allowed to appropriate modes of Western installation art, minimalism, etc. But artists in the north are not allowed to appropriate something from the south. You know, that is too limiting. I mean, that's, I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear enough here.
Thank you, Susie. We have a couple of questions on the chat. I'm going to read them. Well, Blanca said, yes.
I don't know, where can I see the questions they're in the chat?
Yeah. So the two that are still waiting
Okay, well,
are Blanca and Guillermo.
Yeah, okay. Go ahead.
Okay, so it says, Blanca says, thank you for your enlightening conference. And she says about the work of Salcedo, you mentioned that November 6th and 7th, it's an act of memory or an event of memory before of being a work of art. Can we say the same thing of Shibboleth? And if so, how does this work operates with the Tate public? So she's asking about the interaction between the Shibboleth and the public.
Yeah, well, they're of course they're very different. They're very different works. But what I tried to say was simply what seemed striking was that November 6th and 7th was not understood at the time as a work of art. Because perhaps, I mean, it was a broad, most people in the broad public don't go to art museums, right? It's only a very small percentage of people who know developments in contemporary art. So the public reaction at the time in the media was more about the event and the reference to the original event of 1985, the massacre. It was not recognized or discussed as a work of art. Whereas the work in the Tate Modern was from the very beginning constructed and, you know, commissioned, constructed and understood as a work of art in a museum. The reaction of the audience, I don't really have that much to say it. I mean, I think from what I know about the reception of Shibboleth was that it was largely positive. People were intrigued by it. They tried to figure it out. They went back to the Bible. They went online trying to find out what the word Shibboleth means and how it might be mispronounced, probably with a Shibboleth, the Sibboleth kind of sound, and Shibboleth, etc. And you know, to the extent that they were interested, they engaged with it in that way, productively. But there was also a critique by Julian Stellenbras in an essay, who said that once that work was over and was done, it had disappeared. But my argument against that is really that it did not really disappear. Its trace is still visible in the ground. The crevice has been filled. It is still visible if you look at it. If you don't look for it, you're not going to notice it maybe, but it is still visible like a trace. And to that extent, it traces memory. I hope that answers the question to some extent.
Por supuesto, podemos regresar sobre las preguntas. We can go over through specific things, but I think it did. Yeah, Blanca says thank you. Then Guillermo asks, do you consider that the main bet from the Global South for the memory art consists in the convivence of multiple narratives and counter-narratives in the spaces of memory? Like in the case of Fragmentos, where state, victims, and the artist interact in a place where different temporalities, actors, and such give significance to the work, in the case of Salcedo?
Yes, I mean, I think, Guillermo, the question, if I understand it right, addresses the issue of not collective memory, I don't like the term collective memory anymore. It meant something very specific in Halbwachs's work, having to do with familial memory and the national kind of coding of it. And what we see today, there is no collective memory anywhere. There are group memories, and there are primarily battles of memory. And you mentioned fragmentos, which is, of course, part of my book project also, this memorial space that Salcedo has erected, has built in Bogota itself. Fragmentos is deeply fought over, battled over in Colombia. It was built with it created a kind of narrative, a victim narrative, a mourning narrative, with its floor being created out of 37 tons of steel from the guerrillas' weapons. It created a mourning narrative, a narrative about the peace that these weapons had actually been handed over and had become the floor in the Fragmentos space. But at the same time, we now have a new government, the government of Duque, conservative government, which goes back on the peace treaty in Colombia and threatens, I have to put it that way, to create his own museum of memory. And if the conservative government creates a museum of memory, you know that the FARC will be the only ones responsible for the mayhem of the past 50 years. And the military is going to be excused, and the paramilitaries will probably not even be mentioned. So we don't have collective memories. We should not fool ourselves. And I don't think memory art anywhere. I mean, in the 90s, everybody talked about collective memory. We need collective memory. But it is a delusion to think that we can ever arrive at it, because that ignores the political fissures, the political battles going on in every society. So you're right. There are multiple narratives, and they divide again. I mean, if you look at Salcedo, for instance, she focuses on women's narratives, sexual abuse, and sexual violence, whereas others focus on not on women's violence, but on male violence. So within the narrative of violence, there are all kinds of multiple narratives going on in this whole memory, in this whole, what you call memory debt.
Thank you.
We have another question by Adrian. It says, all the cases you have presented today, they have an important load of sensorial affective relationship with the past. Which role do you think that these elements have in your own definition of the concept of memory? Thinking also that these are artworks thought from a language that goes beyond frontiers and national sensibilities.
I don't understand. Did you say sensorial? That
Yeah,
these works I discussed suggest a kind of censorship?
In terms of senses, in terms of haptic.
Oh no, in terms of the senses.
The senses,
the senses.
The senses, sensual, so not sensorial.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, because I thought about censorship, that no.
No, more than senses. Okay.
Yeah. No, I think
senses and affection. Sorry.
Yeah, that is my main argument. That I claim that. I mean, let's take Salcedo's work. Salcedo creates sculptures. These sculptures are minimalist, but they are loaded up with affect, with emotion, okay? That comes out of the context of what she represents by not representing it. I mean, this kind of negative aesthetic. And it's, of course, my own writing is, I hope that it carries over this kind of affective dimension of the work, because I'm, as a spectator of this work and as somebody who has grappled with these artists' work on difficult political histories, my relation to that is itself very affective. I'm not claiming to be an objective viewer of the work and then make judgments, but I try to in my writing, I try to sort of recreate, as it were, in language. It's maybe a mouthful. I'm trying to recreate in language to some extent what these works have achieved in me as a spectator, the effects they have created in me as a spectator. And that's, of course, there's a dimension of subjectivity, but hopefully not only my own subjectivity. In other words, I hope the descriptions are not just self-indulgent. Anyway.
Thank you. We don't have any more questions on the chat. ¿Alguien quisiera hacer alguna otra pregunta? Somebody wants to make another question. I would like to make one, if I may.
Okay.
So you were speaking about the act of memory, and I'm not a historian. I come more from a communication background.
Right.
And with the digital era, they are talking about acts of journalism, for example.
Acts of what?
Acts of journalism.
Yeah.
That a regular citizen can make an act of journalism to document something.
Okay.
And it's related to this democratization of media or ways of expressing that are not like just the regular media or the artist able to speak about things. How does this act of memory, it's connected with the social tissue to try to make it just not an individual experience, but actually try to build group memory or to try to build an act that could be shared with others? How we jump from the individual act of memory to a collective act of memory?
Yeah, okay. Diego, this is a very difficult question.
Sorry about that.
Of course, I mean, it has occupied me in my writing since my book, Twilight Memories, which tried to argue about the coexistence of acts of memory and social political amnesia that is rampant certainly in Western societies, mainly fostered through a culture of consumption, of permanent consumption. So there was a hope, of course, in the 1990s that digital media would democratize. In other words, what Bertolt Brecht dreamt of in the 1920s, in other words, that media would not only work top down toward their audiences, right, but would work bottom up, and could reply to the authorities, to the elites, etc. This clearly has been realized with certain aspects of the social media today. But I think we no longer have today, that's my opinion, this illusion of democratization, because what it has also produced is new communities of fake news, QAnon, the conspiracy theories. I mean, think of Bolsonaro's Telegram, channel that he has started in Brazil. I mean, he's 2 steps ahead of Donald Trump, right? Donald Trump still wants to have his own Twitter because Twitter doesn't publish him anymore, but hasn't gotten it yet. Bolsonaro already has. So there is a kind of democratization, but it also, the other side, the dark side of this democratization, clearly is the kind of prevalence of, of false news, of conspiracy theories, and of a simple culture of lies. And how does one deal with that? I'm not sure. I don't have an answer. I also don't know enough about how these digital platforms operate. But one writer who has been very informative for me, who is translated now into English, is Roberto Zimanovsky. I don't know if any of you are knowledgeable of his work. He used to be a literary scholar and went from literature into the digital. And he wrote one book in particular called Facebook Society. And it shows how Facebook as a digital medium destroys the structure of narratives that we as human beings depend on, okay? Destroys the structure of narratives by, either thumbs up or thumbs down, right? Like it, don't like it, in a very simple way. And his analysis, I think, is very powerful. It's not only, he doesn't analyze just what is being told in the digital world, the kinds of messages that are sent through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, whatever, but how they work technologically and what they do in relationship to communication, to human communication, as it used to be before the digital. So that's a very important kind of question. Let me raise one other aspect. Alexander Kluge, the German filmmaker and writer, once spoke about the attack of the present on the rest of time. In other words, the attack of the present on the past and on the future. And this was before the internet was actually invented, but it already got to a phenomenon that we have to face in some ways. The internet is able to incorporate everything that before was only available in memory. We have every film from the 1920s and the 1930s. We have information, we have data banks, we have archives available at the touch of the fingertip, right? So there is memory. Memories can get sucked into the present through the algorithm, can get sucked into the present of the digital world. This is a very important kind of progress in terms of the availability of memories of the past. And we all, but it also has dangerous sides that it makes one forget that these works, let's say films of the 1920s or 30s, were created in a completely different historical situation. And that people, once they get just sucked into the present, will judge them just by what they say. So if somebody in a film of that earlier period makes a comment about Negroes, people will start immediately up and say, oh, this is racist, okay? Because they don't have a sense that the word Negro meant, in the United States context now, perhaps elsewhere as well, that the word Negro had a different function, a different value, a different position at the time in the 1920s from what it does now, okay? So that kind of presentism, the pulling of the past into the present, creates problems for an identity politics in the contemporary world, which I consider just insidious and diminishing the human condition. And I don't know, look, I'm not saying that minorities should not insist on their identity being recognized in a majority society. I'm not saying that at all. Very much on the contrary, this is important, but it has that other side, that other narrowing kind of side, that others who are not members of the minority are not able to even speak to the issues a minority faces.
Things can be there maybe, but there's no way of communicating specifically what they are, how to value them. And that's a counterpart, I think, of this transnational perspective that you're posing, that sometimes it's just miscommunication or just to be aside or present with things that you actually don't understand, but that are part of your present right now, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's right. And look, I was for many years, I've known these artists that I'm writing about, Sundaram, Salcedo, and Nalani, Kwiatka as well, and Kentridge, since the late 1990s. But I'm by training a literary scholar, so I'm not supposed to dabble in art history and in art criticism. I'm, a scholar of European literature, comparative literature, mainly European materials. So how can I do that? And I was hesitant to engage with this material. And I recognized that the problem for me became especially important in the work of Nalini Malani, who sort of incorporates very complex Indian mythologies and Indian politics in all of her work, which is very hard to understand for a Westerner. One doesn't understand the subtleties. One doesn't understand the narrative that she creates. And I mean, I've known her since the late 1990s. She knew my work on German memory politics. And she then thought it would be nice if I could write something about her work, you know, but it needed a lot of education on my part, delving into research, reading some of these Indian epics and still not understanding them fully and getting help in understanding to make sense of this work. So your point is very well taken. How does one guarantee that either her work or Salcedo's work is understood in a context outside of their own country and even inside their own country? Salcedo's work of installation, Noviembre 67, proves it, was not understood as an artwork when it first happened, right? It was understood as something that referred to this event of 1985. So you're absolutely right. There are difficulties of understanding that we have to deal with. But these difficulties, I think that I'm an optimist, can be overcome if one engages with the work on its own terms.
Thank you. ¿Alguien más quiere hacer una pregunta? Somebody else wants to make a question? Okay, so I think we don't have any more questions. So I'll pass the word to Adrian that he's going to make the closure.
Okay. Well, thank you all for the questions. This was a productive discussion, I hope.
Thank you. Adrián, todo tuyo.
Muchas gracias. Pues solo queda agradecer. We want to thank Professor Huyssen for his lecture y agradecer también a los participantes, agradecer mucho al doctor Diego Zavala, a nombre del Seminario de Memoria y Cultura, por su apoyo de lujo en esta presentación. Muchísimas gracias a todos por sus preguntas y por el debate.
Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Gracias.
Yeah. It was a pleasure.